The Ancient City, Book 3, Chapter 15. Relations between the Cities. War, Peace, the Alliance of the Gods. This religion, which exercised so powerful an empire over the interior life of the city, intervened with the same authority in all relations between cities. We may see this by observing how men of those ancient ages carried on war, how they concluded peace, and how they formed alliances. Two cities were two religious associations which had not the same gods. When they were at war, it was not the men alone who fought. The gods also took part in the struggle. Let no one suppose that this was simply a poetical fiction. There was among the ancients a very definite and a very vivid belief, by reason of which each army took its gods along with it. Men believed that these gods took an active part in the battle. The soldiers defended them, and they defended the soldiers. While fighting against the enemy, each one believed he was fighting against the gods of another city. These foreign gods he was permitted to detest, to abuse, to strike. He might even make them prisoners. Thus, war had a strange aspect. We must picture to ourselves two armies facing each other. In the midst of each are its statues, its altar, and its standards, which are sacred emblems. Each has its oracles, who have promised it success, its augurs, and its soothsayers, who assure it the victory. Before the battle, each soldier in the two armies thinks and says, like the Greek in Euripides, "The gods who fight for us are more powerful than those of our enemies." Each army pronounces against the other an imprecation like that which Macrobius has preserved. "O gods, spread fear, terror, and misfortune among our enemies. Let these men and whoever inhabits their lands and cities be deprived by you of the light of the sun. May their city and their lands and their heads and their persons be devoted to you." After this imprecation, they rush to battle on both sides, with that savage fury which the notion that they have gods fighting for them, and that they are fighting against strange gods, inspires in them. There is no mercy for the enemy. War is implacable. Religion presides over the struggle, and excites the combatants. There can be no superior rule to moderate the desire for slaughter. They are permitted to kill the prisoners and the wounded. Even outside the field of battle, they have no idea of a duty of any kind towards the enemy. There are never any rights for a foreigner, least of all in time of war. No one was required to distinguish the just from the unjust in respect to him. Mucius Scaevola and all the Romans believed it was a glorious deed to assassinate an enemy. The consul Marcius boasted publicly of having deceived the king of Macedonia. Paulus Emilius sold as slaves 100,000 Epirots who had voluntarily surrendered themselves to him. The Lacedaemonian Phoebus seized upon the citadel of the Thebans in time of peace. Agesilaus was questioned upon the justice of this action. "Inquire only if it is useful," said the king, "for whenever an action is useful to our country, it is right." This was the international law of ancient cities. Another king of Sparta, Cleomenes, said that all the evil one could do to enemies was always just in the eyes of gods and men. The conqueror could use his victory as he pleased. No human or divine law restrained his vengeance or his cupidity. The day on which the Athenians decreed that all the Mytileneans, without distinction of age or sex, should be exterminated, they did not dream of transcending their rights, and when on the next day they revoked their decree and contented themselves with putting 1,000 citizens to death and confiscating all the lands, they thought themselves humane and indulgent. After the taking of Plataea, the men were put to death and the women sold, and yet no one accused the conquerors of having violated any law. These men made war not only upon soldiers, but upon an entire population, men, women, children, and slaves. They waged it not only against human beings, but against fields and crops. They burned houses and cut down trees. The harvest of the enemy was almost always devoted to the infernal gods, and consequently burned. They exterminated the cattle. They even destroyed the seed which might produce a crop the following year. A war might cause the name and race of an entire people to disappear at a single blow, and change a fertile country into a desert. It was by virtue of this law of war that the Romans extended a solitude around their city. Of the territory where the Volscians had 23 cities, it made the Pontine marshes. The 53 cities of Latium have disappeared. In Samnium, the places where the Roman armies had passed could no longer be recognized, less by the vestiges of their camps than by the solitude which reigned in the neighborhood. When the conquerors did not exterminate the vanquished, they had a right to suppress their city, that is to say, to break up their religious and political association. The worship then ceased, and the gods were forgotten. The religion of the city being destroyed, the religion of every family disappeared at the same time. The sacred fires were extinguished. With the worship fell the laws, civil rights, the family, property. Everything depended upon religion. Let us listen to the prisoner whose life is spared. He is made to pronounce the following formula. I give my person, my city, my land, the water that flows over it, my boundary gods, my temples, my movable property, everything which pertains to the gods, these I give to the Roman people. From this moment, the gods, the temples, the houses, the lands, and the people belonged to the victors. We shall relate farther on what the result of this was under the dominion of Rome. When a war did not end by the extermination or subjection of one of the two parties, a treaty of peace might terminate it. But for this, a convention was not sufficient. A religious act was necessary. Every treaty was marked by the immolation of a victim. To sign a treaty is a modern expression. The Latins said, strike a kid, icere hodus, or fodus. The name of the victim most generally employed for this purpose has remained in the common language to designate the entire act. The Greeks expressed themselves in a similar manner. They said, offer a libation, spendesthai. The ceremony of the treaty was always accomplished by priests who conformed to the ritual. In Italy they were called feciales, and spendophoroi, or libation carriers, in Greece. These religious ceremonies alone gave a sacred and inviolable character to international conventions. The history of the Caudine Forks is well known. An entire army, through its consuls, quaestors, tribunes, and centurions, had made a convention with the Samnites, but no victims had been offered. The Senate, therefore, believed itself justified in declaring that the treaty was not valid. In annulling it, no pontiff or patriarch believed that he was committing an act of bad faith. It was the universal opinion among the ancients that a man owed no obligations except to his own gods. We may recall the saying of a certain Greek, whose city adored the hero Alabandos. He was speaking to an inhabitant of another city that worshipped Hercules. Alabandos, said he, is a god, and Hercules is not one. With such ideas, it was important, in a treaty of peace, that each city called its own gods to bear witness to its oath. We made a treaty and poured out the libations, said the Plataeans to the Spartans. We called to witness, you the gods of your fathers, we the gods who occupy our country. Both parties tried indeed, if it was possible, to invoke divinities that were common to both cities. They swore by those gods that were visible everywhere, the sun which shines upon all, and the nourishing earth. But the gods of each city and its protecting heroes touched men much more, and it was necessary to call them to witness if men wished to have their oaths really confirmed by religion. As the gods mingled in the battles during the war, they had to be included in the treaty. It was stipulated, therefore, that there should be an alliance between the gods as between the men of the two cities. To indicate this alliance of the gods, it sometimes happened that the two peoples agreed mutually to take part in each other's sacred festivals. Sometimes they opened their temples to each other and made an exchange of religious rites. Rome once stipulated that the city god of Lanuvium should thenceforth protect the Romans, who should have the right to invoke him and to enter his temple. Afterwards, each of the contracting parties engaged to worship the divinities of the other. Thus the Aelians, having concluded a treaty with the Aetolians, thenceforth offered an annual sacrifice to the heroes of their allies. It often happened after an alliance that the divinities of two cities were represented by statues or medals holding one another by the hand. Thus it is that there are medals on which are seen united the Apollo of Miletus and the Genius of Smyrna, the Pallas of the Cydians and the Artemis of Perga, the Apollo of Hierapolis and the Artemis of Ephesus. Virgil, speaking of an alliance between Thrace and the Trojans, represents the Penates of the two nations united and associated. These strange customs correspond perfectly with the idea which the ancients had of the gods. As every city had its own, it seemed natural that these gods should figure in battles and treaties. War or peace between two cities was war or peace between two religions. International law among the ancients was long founded upon this principle. When the gods were enemies, there was war without mercy and without law. As soon as they were friends, the men were united and entertained ideas of reciprocal duties. If they could imagine that the protecting divinities of two cities had some motive for becoming allies, this was reason enough why the two cities should become so. The first city with which Rome contracted ties of friendship was Caere, in Etruria, and Livy gives the reason for this. In the disaster of the Gallic invasion, the Roman gods had found an asylum in Caere. They had inhabited that city and had been adored there. A sacred bond of friendship was thus established between the Roman gods and the Etruscan city. Thenceforth, religion would not permit the two cities to be enemies. They were allied forever. Footnote: It does not enter into our plan to speak of the numerous confederations, or amphictyonies, in ancient Greece and Italy. We will only remark here that they were as much religious as political associations. There was not one of them that had not a common worship and a sanctuary. That of the Boeotians worshipped Athena Itonia, that of the Achaeans Demeter Panachaea. The god of the Ionians in Asia Minor was Poseidon Heliconius, and that of the Dorian Pentapolis was Apollo Triopicus. The confederation of the Cyclades offered a common sacrifice in the Isle of Delos, the cities of Argolis at Caloria. The Amphictyony of Thermopylae was an association of the same nature. All their meetings took place in temples and were principally for offering sacrifices. Each of the confederate cities sent citizens clothed for the time with a sacerdotal character, called theori, to take part in these meetings. A victim was slain in honor of the god of the association, and the flesh, cooked upon the altar, was shared among the representatives of the cities. The common meal, with the songs, prayers, and sacred plays that accompanied them, formed the bond of the confederation. The same usage existed in Italy. The cities of Latium had the Feriae Latinae, in which they shared the flesh of a victim. It was the same with the Etruscan cities. Besides, in all these amphictyonies, the political bond was always weaker than the religious one. The confederate cities preserved perfect independence. They might even make war against each other, provided they observed a truce during the federal festival.